The first thing we can do, if we go ahead and move into another folder here called configuration 2, is we'll extract out the dependency on this settings file into something that we can inject with our test. So what this would let us do is specify an interface called iConfiguration settings, and then push in that interface through what's called dependency injection and the strategy pattern, which we'll learn about more in the dependency inversion principle talk. Otherwise, our class, if it doesn't have anything passed in, will default to using the configuration settings.settings property that it was actually using before. So with this refactoring, we've gone from our initial setup that had an about page that simply was hard-coded to use this static property called configuration settings.settings to now one that goes and uses an interface that gets set to a field, this private read-only underscore configuration settings, and then that is the class that's used in the render method. So where's this interface? Well, we created this interface by looking at all the things that our configuration settings class needed, and I added some comments here that kind of shows what I consider to be the general gist of each of these settings. So we have some application identity settings, some performance tuning settings, data access settings, and web service API settings. Now all of these things are in one interface because we have the same configuration settings class that we had before, but we are going to make it so it inherits from the iConfiguration settings interface. Now, truth be told, it was doing this before because I've only got one of these classes in my solution, but it wasn't important until we got to this refactoring step. If we look at our test code now in configuration 2, we've got about page should still, and you'll see that if we call about page now, which is in configuration 2, it should still work, and this is the exact same test we had before, but we're also now able to create our own implementation of iConfiguration settings and basically create a fake version of our configuration here. And I've done that, and I've set it to be a test app name and a test author name as my two values that I care about. And then I also still had to implement this other huge interface with all these other things that I don't care about. And I've done what most people do, which is I take that ugly stuff that I don't want anyone to see and I sweep it under the rug using the region tag. Anytime you see people putting things in a region tag that, you know, they don't want you to see, or that they're cluttering up the class, usually that's a smell, and it's telling you that these are things that need to be somewhere else, need to be refactored, need to be gotten rid of. So the next thing that we can do once we've got this class is we can take the settings class and pass that into our about page, and now we can actually write tests that don't rely on a configuration file. We can show that this particular value right here for test author name and test app name is actually what we get when we run this test. And so if we run the tests that are in this class, we'll see that they both pass, showing that the original implementation of running from the config file still works. And now we're also able to run this test with our own implementation through the use of the interface that's being injected into our about page class. So this is all very nice, and it's getting us a little bit further away from our dependency on the configuration file. It hasn't really done anything for us in terms of segregating our interface. We took our big fat interface that was configuration settings, and that class's interface consisted of all of these public values here. And we simply moved that from a class interface to an actual C# interface that still had the exact same signature. So we made a little bit of progress, but we didn't really get to the point where we're conforming with the interface segregation principle. So the next step is to go and look at our about page and say what are, in configuration 3, the next step is to look at about page and say what are the actual things that we depend on. And so we've realized, especially after looking at the comments on iConfiguration settings, about what exactly these things are, we realize that we only care about application identity settings on this page. And so we can create our own interface called iApplication Identity Settings, and we'll define it right here. And it only includes the application name and the author name. Now, once we make this change, we have an about page that works fine for any new implementation, but if someone is still passing it the old configuration settings class, this is going to break because configuration settings doesn't know anything about iApplication identity settings. And furthermore, if we break the configuration settings and make it so that it no longer has these two properties on its main interface, but only has them on this sub interface, that's going to cause some other things to break. So in order to make this work, we're going to have to make some changes to our base interface. And so if I do that right now, all of this will work, and I can get rid of my to-do fix comments. So if we undo this stuff right now, we'll see that this doesn't work because I'm passing in configuration settings, but I'm expecting iApplication identity settings. So in order to make that work, I can simply delete this stuff here from my main interface. And I can go and say, well, actually, this interface inherits from iApplication identity settings, which, oh, by the way, I need to go and implement that other namespace. But once I do that, now everything magically works again because this interface and the other are now the same as they were before. I'm able to rely on just that subset of the interface that I care about, and everyone else is still able to use the exact same interface they used before. So through this simple refactoring, I'm able to apply the interface segregation principle and get myself away from having to depend on that fat interface without breaking anything else that's depending on the existing interface. If we look at our tests, we'll see there's a little bit more that we have to do here, basically in terms of uncommenting stuff. So this wouldn't have worked before, but now I can uncomment it and it should work. We can see I've got a test settings like I had before, but there's no longer any ugly region with stuff that is not being implemented. I'm only using the interface that I actually need. And I can run my test now with just this small interface and see that it works. So if we run these tests, we see that they pass.